It was a normal morning in Rome. A clerk was doing paperwork. Somewhere in a palace, a boy was sitting on a throne. His name was Romulus Augustulus. He was 15 years old, and he was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. A man named Odoacer walked in. He was a Germanic chieftain, a soldier, a man who had served Rome his entire life. He didn't kill the boy. He just told him it was over. Romulus was sent to a villa in Campania, southern Italy. Nice weather, a pension to live on. And then Odoacer did something strange. He picked up the imperial regalia, the crown, the royal robes, the symbols of Roman power, and packed them into a box. He sent that box east, to Constantinople, to Emperor Zeno. The message inside was simple. The West doesn't need its own emperor anymore. One is enough. No final battle. No city burning. No last stand. Just a package in the mail. The end of the Roman world did not sound like a scream. It sounded like paperwork. But here's the truth. Rome had been dying for a long time before that morning. At its height, Rome was not just a city. It was a machine. Roman roads connected every corner of Europe. You could travel from Scotland to Syria on the same road system. Thousands of miles, all paved, all maintained, all pointing back to Rome. Legions held the borders. The Rhine in the north, the Danube in the east, the deserts of North Africa in the south. Trained soldiers, disciplined, professional, the most effective fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. Aqueducts carried clean water into cities. Not just the capital. Cities across the empire had running water. Public baths, fountains, sewage systems, things that most of the world wouldn't have again for another 1,000 years. Roman law governed trade across 3 continents. If you had a contract dispute in Egypt, you used the same legal framework as a merchant in Spain. The system worked. People trusted it. The Mediterranean was not a sea. It was Rome's lake. But here's the thing about machines. The bigger they get, the more they need to keep running. Think about it this way. One soldier costs money. Feed him, pay him, arm him, replace him when he dies. That's one soldier. Rome had hundreds of thousands of them. And those soldiers didn't just fight. They built roads. They maintained forts. They patrolled borders that stretched for thousands of miles. Every single day, whether there was a battle or not. The roads had to be resurfaced. Bridges had to be inspected. Aqueducts built up calcium deposits inside the pipes. If engineers didn't clean them out regularly, water pressure dropped. Flow slowed. The whole system started to quietly fail. A city of 1 million people needed to be fed. Every day. That meant grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul. Ships crossing the Mediterranean constantly. Ports that never closed. Dock workers, administrators, inspectors, tax collectors, all of them needed to be paid. At its peak, Rome's bureaucracy was one of the most complex administrative systems ever built. That was also its problem. Rome didn't fall because of war. It started falling when the machine got too heavy to run. Here's how the spiral worked. The empire needed money. Soldiers don't fight for free. Roads don't fix themselves. So Rome taxed its people. Farmers in North Africa, merchants in Syria, craftsmen in Gaul, everyone paid. For a while, it worked. But wars kept coming, borders kept shifting. New threats meant new legions. New legions meant more money. So taxes went up. Higher taxes made farmers poorer. Poorer farmers produced less. Less production meant less tax revenue, which meant the government needed even more money. So taxes went up again. Some farmers walked away from their land entirely. It wasn't worth it anymore. Abandoned farmland meant abandoned tax base. The problem got worse. The government started cutting corners. Roads that used to be repaired every few years went a decade without maintenance. Small cracks became potholes. Potholes became stretches of broken stone that traders avoided. When traders avoided a road, the towns along that road got poorer. Poorer towns paid less tax. The machine was eating itself. And then came the moment that changed everything. When tax revenue wasn't enough, and it was never enough anymore, The emperors found another way. They looked at the coins in the treasury. The Roman denarius, silver, reliable, trusted across the entire known world. A soldier knew what a denarius was worth. A merchant in Alexandria knew. A farmer in Britain knew. And the emperors realized something. If you melt down 1,000 silver coins and add just a little copper, you can make 1,100 coins. Same size, same weight, almost the same color, but not the same value. They did it once, it worked, nobody noticed immediately. So they did it again, and again, and again. By the time people started to notice, it was too late. Imagine you are a baker in Rome. You wake up before sunrise. Every morning, you mix the dough, heat the oven, bake the bread, same as always. But lately, something is wrong. The wheat costs more than it did last year. Not a little more, a lot more. You charge your customers more to cover it. They complain. Some of them stop coming. Next year, wheat costs more again. You raise your prices again. Your customers look at you like you are stealing from them. But you are not stealing. The money is. The main coin of Rome was called the denarius. For centuries, it was almost pure silver, reliable, stable. A soldier knew what it was worth. A farmer knew. A merchant crossing 3 countries knew. People trusted the denarius the way we trust a bank today. But starting around the 3rd century, something changed. The emperors needed money. Wars were expensive. The army was expensive. The bureaucracy was expensive. And tax revenue was not keeping up. So they made a decision. Take the silver coins, melt them down, add a little copper, pour them back into molds. At first, the denarius was around 90% silver. Then 80. Then 50. By the time of Emperor Gallienus in the 3rd century, the denarius was about 2% silver. 2%. It was basically a copper coin with a thin silver wash on the outside. Rub it between your fingers long enough and the silver came off. Merchants noticed. They always notice. If the coins in your hand are worth less than they were last year, you charge more coins for the same goods. That is not greed. That is survival. Prices rose. Not because harvests were bad, not because there was a shortage, but because nobody trusted the money anymore. This is what historians call inflation. But for the people living through it, it did not have a name. It just felt like everything getting harder. The baker raised his prices, the farmer raised his prices, the landlord raised his rent. Everyone was trying to stay ahead of money that kept losing value. And the government kept making more of it. But here is where it got worse. The soldiers noticed too. A Roman soldier was paid in denarii. That was the deal. You serve the empire pays you. But when the denarius lost its value, soldiers were effectively getting a pay cut every year without anyone telling them. So they stopped accepting coins. They demanded payment in goods instead: grain, oil, clothing, boots, real things with real value. The government had no choice but to agree. Which meant now, instead of sending bags of coins to the frontier, Rome had to organize convoys of food and supplies. More logistics, more administrators, more cost. The machine got heavier. They didn't just debase their coins. They debased their future. When people lose trust in money, something else breaks too. They stop making long-term plans. Why build a new workshop if you don't know what anything will cost next year? Why sign a 10-year contract when the currency might be worthless by then? The economy stopped moving forward. And when the economy stopped moving forward, people stopped believing the empire was going anywhere either. Picture a craftsman living in Rome. Not a rich man, not a senator, just a regular person. He makes things with his hands, sells them at the market, comes home tired. His apartment is modest, 1 room, maybe 2, but there is something remarkable about it. There is running water. A pipe connected to the city's aqueduct system runs near his building. Clean water, every day. Something most people in the ancient world could not even imagine. He does not think about it much. Nobody thinks about water until it stops. At its peak, Rome had 11 aqueducts. 11 massive structures carrying fresh water from mountains and springs into the city. Some of them ran for over 50 miles. Built from stone and concrete, engineered with a precision that still impresses modern architects. The Aqua Claudia, the Ennio Novus, the Aqua Marcia. These were not just pipes. They were monuments, symbols of what Rome could do. At full capacity, Rome's aqueduct system delivered over 1 million cubic meters of water every single day. Public baths, fountains on every street corner, water for cooking, for cleaning, for the city's sewage system. For 1 million people living inside one city, water was not a luxury. It was the difference between civilization and collapse. But aqueducts are not magic. They are engineering, and engineering needs maintenance. Calcium deposits build up inside the channels over time, slowly, quietly. The flow gets a little weaker each year, not enough to notice at first. Small cracks appear in the stone, water seeps through, the ground underneath softens. A section shifts. Tree roots grow into the joints between stones. None of these things are catastrophic on their own. A crew of engineers can fix a calcium buildup in a week. A cracked section can be repaired in a day. But that requires money, and engineers, and a government that is paying attention. When the money started running out, maintenance was one of the first things cut. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just deferred. We will fix it next year. We will get to it eventually. Next year became 5 years. 5 years became never. So our craftsman's water doesn't stop in a single day. It weakens. One morning he notices the flow is a little slower than usual. He doesn't think much of it. Old pipes happen sometimes. A month later, slower still. By winter, it is barely a trickle. And then, one morning, nothing. He walks to the public fountain down the street, dry. The bathhouse on the corner has been closed for weeks. He starts carrying water from the river, like his grandfather did. Like people did before Rome built its machine. The aqueducts didn't all fail at once. The real end came in 537 AD, 60 years after the last emperor fell during the Gothic Wars, when an army besieging Rome made a simple, devastating decision. They cut the aqueducts, not because they were brilliant strategists, but because by then everyone knew that was where Rome was most vulnerable. You don't need to break a wall if the pipes are already cracked. You just finish what neglect started. Civilizations rarely collapse in battles. They collapse when systems stop working, when the engineers stop coming, when the repairs stop happening, when the people in charge start believing that things will hold together just a little longer without anyone doing anything. They almost always hold together, right until they don't. Walk into the Pantheon in Rome today. Stand in the center. Look up. Above you is a concrete dome nearly 44 meters wide. No steel reinforcement. No modern materials. Just concrete and engineering. It was built almost 2,000 years ago. It is still standing. Not as a ruin. Not as a skeleton. The dome is intact. The oculus at the top, the circular opening that lets in light and rain, is exactly as it was designed. Modern engineers have studied it for decades. They still argue about how it was built. The secret was in the concrete. Roman concrete was not like modern concrete. It was made with a specific volcanic ash called pozzolana, found in the region around Naples. When mixed with seawater and lime, it created a chemical reaction that produced something extraordinary. It got stronger over time, not weaker. Modern concrete starts degrading after about 50 years. Roman concrete harbor structures have been sitting in the Mediterranean for 2,000 years and are still hardening. The Romans didn't fully understand the chemistry behind it, but they knew the formula, they knew which ash to use, where to find it, how to mix it. Generations of builders passed that knowledge down. And then the empire started to fall. The mines and quarries around Naples were abandoned. The trade routes that carried pozzolana to construction sites across the empire stopped running. The engineers who knew the formula had no one to teach. No new projects to work on, no reason to pass anything down. The knowledge didn't disappear in a fire. It didn't get erased from a library. It just stopped being used. And knowledge that stops being used disappears just as completely as knowledge that gets destroyed, slower, quieter, but just as gone. For nearly 1,000 years after Rome fell, builders across Europe could not replicate what the Romans had done. They used regular lime mortar instead. Cheaper, available, weaker. Their buildings cracked, collapsed, had to be rebuilt every few generations. They looked at the Pantheon and didn't understand it. Some believed it was built by giants. Others said it must have been the work of gods. Not because they were superstitious, but because the gap between what they could do and what they were looking at was so large that ordinary human hands didn't seem like a possible explanation. They had forgotten that their own ancestors built it. That is a particular kind of loss. Not losing a war, not losing territory, losing the memory of what you were capable of. Civilizations don't just lose power, they lose knowledge. And sometimes they lose it so completely that they stop believing they ever had it. Most people learn the story of Rome's fall like this. The empire was great, then barbarians came, they smashed through the gates, Rome burned, the end. It's a clean story. It's also mostly wrong. The people history calls barbarians, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, they were not strangers to Rome. They had been living inside the empire for generations. They served in the Roman army, not as prisoners, not as slaves, as soldiers, as officers. Some of them rose to become generals commanding Roman legions. They wore Roman armor, they used Roman tactics, they spoke Latin. Their children grew up inside Roman cities, went to Roman schools, worshipped in Roman temples. Stilicho, one of the greatest generals in late Roman history, the man who defended Italy against invasion multiple times, was the son of a Vandal. He was as Roman as anyone alive. So when people say barbarians destroyed Rome, the question worth asking is, which barbarians? The ones outside the walls? Or the ones who had been running the army for 50 years? Alaric is a good example. He was a Gothic chieftain. He is famous for leading the sack of Rome in 410 AD, the first time the city had been taken by an enemy in 800 years. But here is what the history books usually leave out. Alaric had served in the Roman army. He commanded Gothic troops fighting for Rome. He wanted a permanent military commission. A recognized rank, the kind of institutional legitimacy that would make his position official. Rome kept promising it, and kept not delivering. He wasn't paid what he was owed. He wasn't given the rank he was promised. He was used when Rome needed him and ignored when Rome didn't. He sacked Rome because he was owed back pay. The most catastrophic military humiliation in 8 centuries of Roman history started as a labor dispute. The barbarians didn't break the door. They were already inside, holding the keys. When Rome stopped paying its soldiers, those soldiers didn't disappear. They were still there, still armed, still organized, still in control of the military infrastructure. They just stopped taking orders from people who couldn't pay them, and started taking orders from their own chiefs instead. The transition wasn't an invasion. It was more like a management change. The same roads, the same forts, the same tax collection machinery, just different people sitting at the top. The empire didn't end because outsiders overwhelmed it. It ended because the people holding it together decided they didn't need the center anymore. They had learned everything Rome knew. They had the army, the land, the systems. The only thing they didn't have was the name. And names, it turned out, were the one thing Rome had left to offer. There was no apocalypse. No single day when everything ended, no morning when people woke up and said, Rome is gone now. Life continued. People went to market. Farmers planted crops. Children were born. Bread was baked. The sun rose and set the same as always. But small things started to change. The roads were the first sign. Roman roads were engineered to last. Layers of stone, gravel, and concrete, drainage channels on the sides, carefully maintained mile markers. At their peak, they were the best roads the world had ever seen. But without maintenance crews, grass started growing in the cracks, then weeds, then small shrubs pushing up through the stone. Merchants found detours around the broken sections. Then the detours became the new roads, and the old Roman roads disappeared under 1,000 years of dirt and growth. Some of them weren't rediscovered until the 20th century. The theaters went quiet. Roman cities had amphitheaters, concert halls, public gathering spaces, culture, entertainment, civic life that gave people a reason to come together. One by one, the performances stopped, not because anyone banned them, just because there was no money to organize them. No audience wealthy enough to pay for them, no civic government stable enough to care. The buildings stood empty for years, then decades. Then people started using the stone for other things. Which brings us to the Colosseum. The greatest arena ever built, 80,000 seats. A retractable awning to shade the crowd. Elevators beneath the floor to lift animals and fighters up into the arena. Engineering so sophisticated that modern stadiums still borrow from its design. For centuries, it was the center of Roman public life. And then it wasn't. People stopped coming. The games ended. The maintenance stopped. The wooden floors rotted. And then, slowly, the Colosseum became something else entirely. Families moved into the arched vaults underneath. Hundreds of people living inside the skeleton of the greatest stadium in history. A church was built inside the arena floor. And then the quarrying started. The marble seating was stripped out first. Useful, valuable, easy to repurpose. Then the stone blocks from the outer walls. Then the iron clamps holding the stone blocks together. Workers drilled into the walls specifically to extract the iron. Those drill holes are still visible today, hundreds of them, pockmarking the ancient stone. The greatest arena in history didn't end in glory. It became a quarry. Nobody made a decision to destroy it. That's the part that's hardest to understand. There was no emperor who ordered the Colosseum torn down, no general who sacked it, no moment of deliberate destruction. Just thousands of ordinary people, over hundreds of years, making practical decisions. I need stone for my wall. There is stone over there, I will take it. The empire didn't collapse. It was disassembled. One stone at a time, one road left unrepaired, one aqueduct left unpatched, one theater left dark, one generation that learned a little less than the one before it. Until one day what remained didn't look like Rome anymore. And nobody alive could remember when it had. Here is something strange. The Roman Senate kept meeting after the Western Empire fell. Not for a year, not for a decade. For over 100 years. Senators still wore their togas, still gave speeches, still followed the ancient procedures that had governed Roman public life for centuries. The rituals continued, the titles continued, the buildings were still there. But the empire those institutions were built to serve was gone. Rome was performing Rome. The Eastern Empire continued from Constantinople. It would last another 1,000 years, what historians call the Byzantine Empire, though the Byzantines themselves never used that name. They called themselves Romans until the very end. In the West, the new Germanic kings took Roman titles, wore Roman symbols of authority, wrote their laws in Latin, built their churches using Roman architectural styles. Everyone wanted to be the heir of Rome, because Rome still meant something. Even after it was gone, the name carried weight, legitimacy, history. The ghost of Rome was more powerful than most living kingdoms. But here is the tragedy. It wasn't that Rome ended. Everything ends. The tragedy is that the people living through it didn't know it was ending. They kept believing the institutions meant something when the substance behind them was already hollow. They kept trusting titles and rituals and names while the roads crumbled, the water stopped, the coins lost their value, and the knowledge slowly disappeared. They were living inside a shell and calling it an empire. And maybe that is the most important lesson Rome leaves us. Not about military strategy, not about economics, not about engineering, but about this. The most dangerous moment for any civilization is not when the enemy is at the gate. It is when the people inside stop believing it is worth defending. When maintaining the road feels like someone else's problem. When fixing the aqueduct can wait until next year. When paying the soldiers is less important than the politics happening in the capital. Rome didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because enough people, over enough time, made enough small decisions that added up to abandonment. The tragedy of Rome isn't that it ended. It's that the people living in it believed it was still Rome long after it was gone. Rome didn't fall because the walls broke. It fell because nobody remembered why those walls were built in the first place. And that is the story of the day Rome forgot it was dying. Thank you for listening to Ancient Stories in English. If this is your first time here, this channel tells stories from history in slow, clear English. Whether you are learning English or just love history, you are welcome here. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. It helps more people find these stories. I will see you in the next one.